Welcome, everybody, to our Bible class this Wednesday. I hope you had a good week. I hope you had a time to carry out those weekly challenges we've been talking about. Today, we are talking about the persecuted church, Smyrna, the letter to the church in Smyrna. So, we're going to see from Revelation chapter 2, verse 8 through 11, that's one of two letters, along with the Philadelphia church, where Jesus does not offer a rebuke. Instead, he acknowledges their suffering and he encourages them to remain faithful, promising a crown of life, particularly to this church. So in this lesson today, we're going to explore some of the historical background of Smyrna, and we're going to look at Jesus' message to the church, including their affliction and how Jesus said that they were spiritually rich despite being poor. We're going to talk about the reality of suffering for those who are faithful, for those who are followers of Christ, and what this promise of the crown of life and victory over the second death are all about. So let's get first into the historical background of Smyrna. So Smyrna was a very wealthy and important city in Asia Minor, pretty much where Turkey is today, the city of Izmir in Turkey. And so Smyrna was known for its loyalty to Rome. They actually built a temple to worship their whole Roman Empire, Roma, the god of Roma, and also emperor worship. It was the center for emperor worship. There were also temples to Cybele and to Zeus. And one of them had an inscription honoring Nero as the savior of the whole human race. Imagine that. So in AD 26, they also erected a temple to the Roman Emperor Tiberius, clearly a center of cult of emperor worship, and it resulted in a lot of sorrow and persecution for the church. They were really maligned for that. Now, Smyrna was a beautiful city. It was a very handsome city, called the most beautiful of all the cities under the sun. Imagine that. There were great buildings on the nearby summit, and they were all called the Crown of Smyrna. Smyrna was next to Ephesus in the sequence that a traveler visiting all of these seven churches would naturally follow. So Smyrna also had a strong Jewish population. Many Jews in Smyrna opposed the Christian church, and they were very quick to report any kind of Christian behavior or services to the Roman authority. So they suffered much persecution from the Jews as well as from the pagans in Smyrna. It was a very hostile environment, as you can imagine. And so imagine the Jews who once before had said, "We have no king but Caesar." Here they proclaim themselves in this city as worshipers of the emperor, clearly throwing away their Jewish heritage and their proclamation to worship the one God. So it was very unfortunate that the Christians in Smyrna were surrounded by people who actually wanted to see them dead, who did not want to be with them at all. Now, Smyrna was also known. The actual name Smyrna means myrrh. And if you know what myrrh is, it's a substance used for embalming. And myrrh is very symbolic in the use of the Bible. It symbolizes suffering and death, which aligns with the church's experience. So it's no coincidence that the city Smyrna means myrrh, and that myrrh is associated with suffering, with death. And this not only reflected the city's association with the trade and the product of myrrh, but also indicated that the church itself, the sacrificial offerings that they were giving as Christians, was a symbol, or was a way that their affliction and their poverty was a fragrant offering to God. Similarly, as in the Old Testament, when the priest offered a sacrifice of myrrh and incense, it was also a fragrant offering to God. So symbolically here, it suggests that Jesus perhaps saw the church as a pleasant and a desirable aroma, much like the scent of myrrh, and much like God delighted in this fragrant offering in the Old Testament. So because the church refused to worship the emperor, they faced severe persecution. And not just that, economic hardship and social exclusion. This church had a lot of pressures from all over them. So what does Jesus say to them? Here in Revelation 2:8, he introduces himself to them as the first and the last, the one who was dead and who came back to life. Jesus is trying to encourage this church. I mean, they faced the threat of death daily. Death was right around the corner for them. And at some point it got really, really intense, as Jesus is going to say here. And so he wants them to understand that he knows what they're going through. He was dead. He died. He went through this, but he offers hope. He came back to life. He's telling them there is hope beyond the afflictions of this life. Even though you may feel like you're going to die, maybe you have nothing to look forward to. Maybe all your hopes and dreams are crushed because of this intense persecution and ostracization. Jesus says, hey, I'm alive, and you can be too. He tells them, I know your affliction, and I know your poverty. Jesus intimately knows what they're going through, but he says, you're rich. He wants them to see beyond the physical. He wants them to see on another plane, a spiritual plane. Despite their material poverty, Jesus says, look, you got to look at the important things. You are spiritually wealthy. And their suffering was not just attributed in the material sense or the physical sense, but imagine they were also emotionally, mentally, spiritually suffering. They were suffering all over. But we have to understand true wealth is not in money, power, or influence, but in faith and endurance, as Jesus says here, in the devotion to Christ. So this is a reminder that following Jesus is going to cost us. It's going to cost us. But there is an eternal spiritual reward. We have to see in faith beyond this physical plane. And so this church, because they was suffering pressures from all sides, they could quickly lose hope with all that was happening. So Jesus is encouraging them. At one point he mentions that, he says here, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are of a synagogue of Satan. It's interesting, this language Jesus uses here to refer to the Jews that were persecuting them. The term synagogue of Satan. So this is like a reference to how anybody who's not for the truth, like the denominations that may think they're in alliance with the truth, but they actually persecute real Christians or turn down real doctrine or water down the doctrine. Any such thing really is a work of the devil. So a few people understand this. They don't realize that what they're doing might look like religion, like authentic religion, but Jesus sees them as a church of the devil. You're worshiping the devil. It's the church of Satan. Funny that there is actually a church of Satan called that. But it's hilarious that really the other churches are as much churches of Satan as they are as well, unless we are aligned with doctrinal truth. That's very, very important. So Jesus says, don't be afraid. He tells them, don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Whoa. They were already suffering. So there was more to come. This is some hard news that Jesus had to tell the Smyrnians, this poor church here that was suffering. He says there's more to come. And these tribulations were not the result of the common afflictions known to man, like sickness. He's not saying, oh, sickness, tiredness, economic challenges. Hey, it's going to be hard for you to send your kid to school or pay your vacation because of hard economic time. No, this is nothing like that, man. These afflictions are attributed to their faithful witness. That's why he has nothing negative to say to this church. They were faithful witnesses of Christ. They were living out the slaughtered lamb's way. They were living out the path. They were aligned to the slaughtered lamb's witness. And notice how Jesus says he's not promising deliverance from suffering. So we need to get that idea straight, right? Just because we're Christians, just because we want to do the right thing, that doesn't mean that we're going to be delivered from trials. Hey, more trials may come. Jesus' encouragement here is to endure it. And that's the reality of this walk in the likeness of a slaughtered lamb. Suffering should not be seen as an obstacle, but part of our journey. It's actually part of what's going to make us better, part of what's going to align us to being a faithful witness, so that we may have hope, the hope that Jesus is going to mention in a bit here. We know from Matthew 5:10 through 12 that faithfulness in suffering is a mark of true discipleship. A true disciple will be persecuted and will endure this kind of suffering. Notice how he says here that the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you. He's mentioning the devil. This is a reference to how those with authority on earth, they're subject to the devil's control. He could have said, hey, the Roman Empire or such and such a governor or such and such a people are going to throw you in prison. Jesus simplifies this. Look, it's the devil. The devil is working behind these entities. People may not know it. They may think they're doing a good job. And this shows that workers around the government or in other agencies, they're really in service of the God of this world, the devil. Our government really is serving the God of this world. There may be some people trying to do good there, but the good that we can do is not do good for community, do good for society. No, the good that we can do, we are the light of the world, the salt of the earth. The good that we can do, all of it is about witnessing faithfully to the gospel of Jesus. That's it. That's our light. Our light is not in deeds to the community or in good deeds to help the government do this. No. Jesus is clear here. Everyone is subject to the devil's control, particularly the government. And so we have to also understand that this is not like, oh yeah, we're going to throw you in jail. You're going to go to Rikers for a few years. No, going to jail in Smyrna back in the first century surely meant a death sentence. They knew what was happening if they were going to be thrown into jail. There was no coming out of it. There was no justice for the Christians. This struggle here is desperate, and martyrdom was the way that they were going to go, which is why Jesus says here at the end, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He's just saying to them, look, hang in there, stick through, because you're going to receive a reward beyond your imagination. So the crown of life here symbolizes the eternal victory, the reward that we're going to get. That's going to obscure any other kind of suffering, the little bit of suffering, the temporary suffering that we went through in this life. Jesus is telling them, look, I won't reject you. You might think you're dejected, poor right now, but you're rich. You're wearing a crown already. I can see it. That's why he tells them they are rich. And it's going to be an everlasting crown, not like the crown that the Roman emperor or the governors would wear, which was nothing. This is an encouragement, family, to remain faithful when facing persecution, imprisonment, death, all for the sake of the gospel. Jesus tells them here, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And then he tells them in the next verse that the one who conquers will never be harmed by the second death. We know that the first death is physical, but the second death, that's the important one. That's the one we want to avoid. That's the eternal death, eternal separation from God, as we will read in Revelation 20:14. Jesus is saying that if we remain faithful, we're not going to experience that second death. We'll never even know what it is. That's the reason why Jesus died on the cross, so that we would never know what it's like to be separated from God. So he's addressing their concern, their real concern in their suffering and their pain for facing persecution and affliction. Naturally, they were fearful of what was to come, fear of death. How am I going to die? Is it going to be painful? Oh my goodness. They probably saw other people dying, and that was a torture for them. But you know what? Death, the first death, is something that we're all going to submit to eventually. But the victor, those who are faithful to the end, we're not going to be hurt by the second death. Talking about Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship for a minute here. In the book, he emphasized the difference between cheap grace, which is grace without discipleship, grace without suffering, and costly grace, the grace that demands sacrifice and faithfulness. I've mentioned that in my lessons before. And this church here in Smyrna was an example of costly grace, an example of walking in the pattern of faithful witness, people who understood the grace of God and were willing to pay the price. They understood that following Jesus meant not being a friend of the world and accepting rejection from society. And they were willing to suffer even unto death because they had their eyes set on the eternal reward. Bonhoeffer himself lived this out, choosing to stand against the Nazi regime, even though it led to his execution. So as modern Christians, we have to ask ourselves, am I living a costly grace? Am I reflecting that costly grace in my life? Or am I okay with cheap grace, a grace that's not even going to help me avoid the second death? Am I willing to suffer for Christ? Or am I going to compromise to avoid discomfort? That's the question. What does that look like today? If we were living as Smyrnians, what would that look like? Well, we would be accepting that suffering is inevitable for true believers, whether in subtle forms, maybe at work or at school, like ridicule or rejection, or severe persecution, like maybe losing a job, maybe having to worry about how you're going to feed your family because you got kicked out of a job for something like that. Number two, spiritual wealth is greater than material wealth. That's the mindset of living as Smyrnians. Our success shouldn't be measured by financial status or bank accounts or popularity or what important job do I have. But really, am I following in the pattern of faithful witness? Am I winning souls? And number three, if we're living as Smyrnians, we have to accept that we're going to endure even more suffering. Are you ready for that? That's the scary part here. That's when faith is really going to shine. Because hardship is not the end. It's just part of the journey. It's part of what's going to make us real disciples. Part of what God's going to use to refine our faith, and even what he's going to use to have other people become faithful witnesses. So I hope you got a lot out of today's lesson, out of the church in Smyrna, out of what Jesus has to tell them. We have 4 discussion questions for tonight. I'm just going to quickly review them. How can we develop the mindset that we are spiritually rich? Even though at times you seem like you're struggling, like you have doubt, you might think, how am I spiritually rich if I still have some doubt about things, or if I'm poor, if I can't really get out of this economic situation, if I'm handcuffed by debt, by what I owe, or misled by emotion, or maybe my health is not too good, I don't feel good. So how can you develop the mindset that indeed you are spiritually rich despite those things? Number 2, what forms of persecution do Christians face today? Have you heard of any? I've heard of quite a few. And what persecution have you experienced? I know that most of us have not shed blood, but maybe other things have happened. Have you faced ridicule? Have you been fired? Have you been reprimanded at your job or anywhere else for sharing your faith? And in spite of that, or in the face of that, how did you remain faithful? Number 3, how does the promise of the crown of life impact your daily faith? Do you think about that? Do you think about what Jesus is promising us? What a crown means, that we're royalty, that we are associated with Elohim, that we will reign with him. How does that impact your daily faith? What does this promise mean to you? And number 4, what does it mean to live with a perspective of eternal victory? Rather than sometimes we live reacting out of fear of suffering. We don't want to lose our jobs. We want to get a better job. We want to make sure we can pay for this, pay that. We're trying to look out for ourselves as opposed to living with a perspective of eternal victory. Defining my moment now, not by what I can see or feel, but by the promise that's coming. So ways that we can answer this question or think about answering is list some of the things that you may fear. Do you fear losing your job? Do you fear not graduating? Do you fear not ever getting married? What are some things that you fear? And share how changing your perspective to one of eternal victory can help you overcome that fear. And we have a weekly challenge, 3 parts to it. Let's memorize James 1:12. Blessed is the one who endures trials, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. What a great way to live with that eternal perspective of victory, by memorizing James 1:12. Number 2, think about some who are struggling among us. There's quite a few that are struggling, whether with health issues or financial issues or some other political or legal issue. Write a letter, send them a message of encouragement to someone who's facing hardship, and encourage them to keep their eyes on the prize and to trust in Jesus. Or maybe do something for them, invite them out to dinner, or in some other way encourage them. And number 3, let's practice that boldness in faith. Let's stand firm. Think of a situation where it would be easier to compromise your faith and stand firm. For example, maybe something at work that you know isn't right, something at school that you know isn't right. Someone's being bullied, somebody is doing something wrong, somebody is lying. How can you stand firm? How can you be a light in that situation? I know it can seem scary, but this is what we're talking about. This is the real deal here. Or maybe be the first to attempt peacemaking in a broken relationship. Maybe you know of a broken relationship. Maybe you broke a relationship. Be bold. Take a stand and be the first one to attempt peacemaking. I pray that you had a great lesson. I pray that the Spirit spoke to you through these words of Jesus Christ. Thank you for your attention, and enjoy the discussions. God bless you.